is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
South Africa is facing a scale of social unrest not seen in nearly 3 decades. There have been days of protests and looting across the country. It was all sparked by the arrest of former President Jacob Zuma. Protests began in his home province of KwaZulu-natal but spread to Gauteng province. Issues of anger over poverty as well as inequality, which remains despite apartheid ending 27 years ago, came to the forefront. The country's economic hub, Johannesburg, was rocked by the violence. This all comes as the COVID-19 pandemic has hit South Africa's economy hard. For over a year now, strict measures aimed at curbing the spread of the virus have resulted in social and economic restrictions. This frustration led to businesses being looted and burnt. Hundreds of people have lost their lives. Amidst all this, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa says the violence and looting was planned and coordinated. In an effort to restore order, he has deployed 25,000 troops to the streets of Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal provinces. On this week's show of Talk Africa, we are going beyond the latest updates to look at the underlying causes for the unrest and unpack how the government is tackling this crisis. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. The current violence in South Africa has left President Cyril Ramaphosa facing both economic and political challenges. A week after protests started, he visited the affected sites and says the economy has been hard hit. CGTN's Asta Tal gives us an overview of the situation.
When President Cyril Ramaphosa first came into office, he pledged to tackle corruption and improve the country's economy. The widespread unrest following the imprisonment of former President Jacob Zuma has put both pledges to the test.
Property has been vandalized and destroyed. Shops have been looted. Law-abiding citizens have been threatened and intimidated. Workers are scared that they may not be able to return to work.
The protest started in the eastern province of KwaZulu-Natal. Zuma is a native of the province where he currently resides. Since then, stores and malls have been looted. Trade routes have been disrupted, including the N3, a major highway linking to Durban's biggest port. The country's COVID-19 immunizations have also been hit hard. COVID-19 vaccination sites in Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal provinces were forced to close following attacks. Jacob Zuma has since started a 15-month jail term for contempt of court. The Constitutional Court handed the sentence after Zuma failed to appear before the Zondo Commission to answer questions. Addressing the court virtually, his counsel pushed for the court to rescind Zuma's jail term. Police have said protests intensified as Zuma challenged his 15-month sentence. Indeed, there is division both in the streets of South Africa and in the ruling African National Congress Party. Zuma still enjoys support from his former party, including that of Ace Magashule, who is currently suspended from his role as a Secretary General of the ANC as he faces a criminal case stemming from corruption charges. For his part, President Ramaphosa has pushed against what he labeled as opportunistic acts.
Some have characterized these actions as a form of political protest. This violence may indeed have its roots in the pronouncements and activities of individuals with a political purpose and in expressions of frustration and anger. At the beginning of this unrest, there may have been some people who sought to agitate for violence and disorder along ethnic lines. We know that the majority of our people have, out of principle, refused to be mobilized along these ethnic lines. However, what we are witnessing now are opportunistic acts of criminality, with groups of people instigating chaos merely as a cover for looting and theft.
The Constitutional Court will now rule on whether to rescind Zuma's jail term. Astatal, CGTN.
Well, joining us now on our panel today, in Johannesburg, Tembisa Fakude. He's a senior research fellow and director at the Africa-Asia Dialogues in Johannesburg, joining us via Zoom. Crown Prince Adil Nchabeleng, the Royal Prince of the Royal Rau Nchabeleng Tribal Authority in Limpopo, South Africa. Also in Johannesburg via Zoom, Mr. Kofi Kwaku, the Africa analyst and senior research fellow at the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. Thank you all, gentlemen, for joining in this discussion. Tembisa, if I may start off with you. South Africa's police have been battling looters and protesters for a while now. The crisis, as many say, has exposed deeper issues within South African society. What would you say is the cause of the unrest, and who exactly is to blame for this?
The current narrative is that the violence was triggered by the arrest of former President Jacob Zuma. And that's the narrative that we currently have from all and sundry in South Africa. But we also know that the violence started amidst a very volatile socio-political situation or an environment in South Africa, with the COVID-19 continuing to destroy lives in South Africa. The level of unemployment has, as a result, increased. Poverty has increased. So there are all those anxieties. And when President Jacob Zuma, who had an organized grouping behind him, which called for his release after he was arrested, that triggered the current violence that we are, some parts of South Africa are still experiencing. But over and above that, I think there are a lot of other underlying political problems, particularly within the governing ANC. And people have said that the factions within the ANC that disagree with the current political trajectory that has been embraced by President Cyril Ramaphosa is also to be blamed for the violence we witnessed last week.
Prince Nchabeleng, what do you think are the reasons? Is this more than just a spontaneous triggering of anger? Is it a political problem, an economic problem? What is your view?
The current riots and uprisings in South Africa is more than anything else an indication. It started off as a political problem whereby masses took onto the streets, one, to demand the unconditional release of former President Jacob Zuma. But then it actually morphed up into now looting and riots that were actually, really, economically motivated. You had a situation whereby we saw a lot of people take to the streets, robbing and looting shops and stealing goods in public shops and everything. And then it's an indication of the socio-economic deeper issues that South Africa is faced with, where poverty is at its highest. You've got over 75% of the youth population currently unemployed. You've got the majority of really the adult, really in South Africa, about 50% of them who are currently out of jobs. So there is a huge scale of poverty. I mean, almost 80% of South Africans are currently poor in South Africa. Currently 34 million people do not have one employment, are living below the breadline in terms of the global standard on breadline within less than $1, $2 a day. And you have a situation whereby most of the households are child-headed households within the current squatter camps and environment.
Right. Kofi, your take on that?
It's a combination, it's an explosive, toxic mix, some kind of cocktail of driving forces. And I think they've already mentioned that. But what is so important is that these are not just up in the air, they're evidence-based. The Statistics SA, which is a government outfit, constantly present the narrative of this evidence about what usually the government would call the three big challenges, which I call the three horsemen: poverty, inequality, unemployment. But I've also added more: corruption, crime, and other things like xenophobia that are also playing out in the background. So these are really, this is really the context from which we can start to understand what really happened last week in South Africa.
Prince, in Chabelang, you know, South Africa, many are looking at it that South Africa has experienced protest before. This is not the first such incident, but past incidences of looting have previously been, you know, synonymous with outbreaks of xenophobia. We can go back to 2019 for that one. So what exactly makes this one different from past incidents?
The difference of this one is the mass-scale looting damage in terms of public and private property, the element of the amount of people actually that came out of the squatter camps. And remember, this was not just a provincial one area where there was a focus. This was a sporadic throughout massive amount of provinces, about 4 to 5 provinces really witnessed a similar incident in this case. Whereas in the past, you would have a situation like this where you would have maybe 1 or 2 provinces, Gauteng or KwaZulu-natal, being the one that is badly affected in terms of the xenophobia or the service delivery, you know, protests and everything. But in terms of the grand scale on public property, public and private property, you know, damage as well as attacks and people looting and taking for themselves, what they felt is due to them. And remember, this is coming out of another situation whereby South Africa has never went through a process whereby there was a redress of the apartheid system, where there was equity in terms of distribution of wealth, right, people being given opportunities. And not only that, the fact that there was never reparations. So you found a situation where people took the law into their own hands and said, this is our own form of reparations. When they were taking, you know, manufacturers, you know, retailers, they were going after shops and everything and taking private goods onto their own possessions, right, and claiming it to be theirs because they feel that they never got anything out of apartheid.
Right. Tembisa, did the scale of the looting, and the outburst from South Africa, did that come as a surprise to you, though?
Well, it didn't come as a surprise to me because we need to remember certain things. One, there was an element of thuggery in this entire process of looting. And the second point is that the people who were protesting under the banner of freeing the former president Jacob Zuma from jail were basically defending lawlessness, because Jacob Zuma defied the court order to go and appear at a commission which was instituted by, amongst others, him, to try and come up with a redress of the past corruption in South Africa. So you are talking about people who are basically perpetuating the unruliness and the defiance by the former president Jacob Zuma. That's the second point. But the other point is, for me, I saw this as the maturing of democracy. We have seen throughout the world, whenever there are protests or riots, people do loot. It happens, and it happened in the United States, and it happened in other parts of Europe. So I think it's part of that maturing of democracy, and South Africa is a democratic country, and people have the right to protest. I'm not encouraging looting, but the fact that you have people who will go out and protest and express their views, that has to be encouraged. What must not be encouraged is thuggery, and it's the looting that we've seen last week, mainly encouraged by the so-called pro-Zuma campaign.
Right. Let me get your thoughts here, Kofi, though, because when you look at that, the scale of the protest, the looting and the burning, would you say, as Tembisa has put it, that is a sign of a maturing democracy?
I would be a bit careful on connecting that with democracy, especially in the wanton nature. So to answer your question that you asked earlier, what makes it so unique? There are 4 things for me. The first one, I would agree with Brown Prince and Chabelang, the scale, but also sort of deliberate localized in 2 provinces. And then the other one is the nature of the violence, the sort of cruelty, wanton destruction, everything that went on. But the third one, added to the violence, is the speed at which it took place so fast in time that the police and the army couldn't even react and then deal with it. And of course, the last one for me that makes it also unique is a seemingly deliberate I wouldn't say planning, but also sudden organized small groups with nobody at the heads who managed to attack in a way that really gave the impression that this was sort of planned and organized. So these are the four elements for me. So coming back to democracy, in a democracy and in terms of maturity, I wouldn't use that term to say because they went out, they were violent, and then they were expressing some kind of maturity. That's a no-no for me. I would disagree with that.
Right. Well, on that note, we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, we'll have more on what is going on in South Africa. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue our discussion. Still with me, Tembisa Fakude, joining us via Zoom from Johannesburg, Crown Prince Adil Nchabeleng, and also joining us, Kofi Kwao, joining us from Johannesburg, all via Zoom. Prince Nchabeleng, I mean, it does seem that the organs of state have come out to try and arrest the situation. But I do want to go back to what the World Bank has said about South Africa, because according to the World Bank, South Africa is one of the world's most unequal countries, with about 20% of the population controlling about 70% of the resources. You would have thought that 27 to 30 years after democracy, there would have been a better access to economic and, and the political sphere. So why hasn't the African National Congress been able to rectify the economic situation?
The current impasse in South Africa economically is the fact that one, we inherited after the democracy a set of agreements which were made actually pre, the democratic dispensation, which said that one, the retention of the wealth in South Africa in terms of the mineral resources, the control of the economy, the major capital sitting at the South African Stock Exchange was actually going to remain in the old apartheid companies as well as individuals who enjoyed the current capital maneuvering of the past. So when Black people took over, when the ANC took over power, they never focused at all in terms of the economic issues and the financial issues and the issues with regards to capital. And we actually liberalized our economy, whereby we allowed a lot of capital flights, where the rules were liberalized for capital to fly out. So the current situation you see, where 80% of South Africa's population is living in poverty, less than really about a percent of actually South Africa, 10% of the current middle class is actually living on a living wage, which just really survival, substantial income. The majority of the wealth is concentrated in few families, not even massive hundreds of families. It's just a few families that have enjoyed the historical, which is apartheid colonial, including the current new democratic dispensation in terms of wealth accumulation and enjoying the aspect of wealth in the South African context. So the poverty you see is systematic. It was created within the institutions of democracy, and there was never a redress of creating an economy which would serve the people. The concentration in terms of the power and the control of the South African Reserve Bank itself does not provide wealth, does not provide income, does not provide any aspect of relief with regards to ensuring that South Africa can grow as an economy. Their focus has just been on making sure that the rand actually can be kept stable and there is no inflation in the economy. And that's not really a function of a Reserve Bank. Reserve Bank is supposed to be creating income, creating wealth, creating jobs, ensuring that the economy is surviving, and injecting required income into the economy whenever needed in order to boost and bolster growth. But that doesn't happen within the South African context. That's why we have a majority of the population currently poor. Those that have not made wealth out of really taking charge or taking advantage of government tenders are left out in the open, especially Black majority in South Africa.
Right. Tembisa, what extent, though, do you still feel that apartheid has affected the current situation?
Well, indeed, apartheid has impacted on what's going on. There's a high level of poverty, as Adil alluded, and the level of inequality remains problematic. But there are projects and systems in place that are attempting or trying to redress and push back those challenges that we continue to see as a result of apartheid. The fact that three of us, I assume all black, sitting here speaking in English, that in itself is a step forward. It was something unheard of before. We've had an economy, there has been, whether we like it or not, a growing black middle class. And again, there's political emancipation. We might not take that for granted. Yes, I do agree that economic power is key and essential, but at the same time, political emancipation for some of us was a priority, and we do have that. Yes, there's still two different economies in South Africa, one for the rich and one for the poor, but the current government, at the risk of sounding as if I'm trying to defend the failures and the successes of the ruling or the governing party, they've done well in terms of bringing certain services to the previously disadvantaged communities in South Africa, particularly the black rural communities in South Africa.
Kofi, do you feel that progress has been too slow, or are there too many unfulfilled expectations following the end of the apartheid in 1994?
Both. I would say both. I think we should also put a bit of focus on the role of the states, the government. What is it doing? If we do a short, even a brief assessment on looking at addressing problems of South Africa, short and long term, there have been a great deal of work done, especially under the Mbeki government, on scenario planning and so forth. All these plans have come to a halt. And literally one of the reasons most of these haven't panned out is the fragility of the state, its role to deliver, to have leaders who have the conscience of taking the country where it should be going. And that fragility starts first in the successive government led by the African National Congress. There's a great deal of fragmentation within the African National Congress. I would even go further to say almost a bloated government. Lists of people who have not really executed what their president have asked them to do. I can't remember the number of ministers now, probably 40 if you include the deputy ministers. And that's a large crowd of people who should be able to deal with all these issues. And one of the lessons we've learned, especially the past 4 decades with China, is if you have a great, solid, stable state,
right,
and competent state, you're most likely to execute and to do well. Now, I know a lot of capitalists don't like to hear that, but the role of the state is essential in leading the country with foresight, with insight, and also delivery. So that role needs to be put on the burner, needs to be discussed. I mean, if you take the government of President Cyril Ramaphosa today, his deputy president is out of the country. His minister of health is now acting. Is not even acting. It's just put on leave.
Right.
And so there are all these elements that fragilize the strength of the state. And until those have been addressed, South Africa is still going to be in a very difficult position to deal with these short and long-term problems.
Prince Nchabeleng, to most of us across the continent, the events in South Africa have been quite unsettling because South Africa is Africa's most advanced economy and clearly one of its richest. What do you think needs to change now? What lessons can other African countries learn from the situation in South Africa?
In terms of South Africa being a model for African countries, most definitely. I mean, we have an institutions that have survived the, post-apartheid era that were actually improved upon within the current new dispensation. But what is currently happening is South Africa is actually downgrading rather than actually upgrading towards becoming a highly efficient, highly, institutionalized, country and a democracy as it's supposed to be. I mean, you can't come from the highest and then you start downgrading or even actually losing your level of momentum. What has happened is, I traveled throughout Africa. I've been throughout Kenya. I've been throughout many other countries in Africa. What I'm seeing is what other African countries have gone through. inherited institutions that were previously colonial, whether it was apartheid at the time or colonial. They inherited those institutions which were highly efficiently run and were actually positioned to grow economies as well as countries. But when the black leadership across the African continent, by the way, when they come in, instead of focusing on growing those economies, growing their countries, actually focusing on bettering their people, their nation, and putting their nation at heart. It doesn't happen. African leaders become dictators. They take on the wealth of the state and they personalize it into their own purposes. And not only that, they then downgrade those particular institutions to serve their own particular needs. This has happened throughout all of Africa. That is why we have now the scaling down or even the breaking down of infrastructure development in South Africa, the really servicing of infrastructure. You're no longer having a rapid growth and development as it was actually pretext before, when we had the when we had the reconstruction and development program where roads were built and everything. Today, we're actually scaling down on all the programs, healthcare, education, infrastructure, public institutions, where we're looking at everything is scaling down. The government is proposing to be cutting over 30% to 40% of its employees.
Right.
You're looking at the technology taking over. So there hasn't been, I would like to agree with my colleagues on the panel to say there is improvement. Yes, there was cosmetic improvement over the period. Fakure is right that, democracy is plagued by challenges, but on the side of it is where I say very clearly and strongly is, whenever there's no checks and balances, where leaders are given a de facto rulership, where they can become de facto really dictators in a way, where they get their way and they use the power that they have to fight against their opponents politically. This is what we're experiencing. South Africa is no longer discussing development.
Right.
We're discussing political maneuvering and meandering.
Kofi, you have the final word here.
Yes, for me, the cost of this last week violent riots will be very huge. We don't even know yet how big they will be. So in short, for the short and long-term solutions to these challenges, I would suggest to look into three things very seriously. The first one is a responsible, accountable, and capable state where there are competent people to run the country. That's one. The second is to deal with the monster of corruption that's now plaguing any delivery that's going on in the country. And the third is to put a serious focus on what is usually called the inclusive economy, so that it's broad enough with entrepreneurs and small and medium-sized enterprises, and then entrepreneurs to be able to come out of this crisis. And I think if these three areas are dealt with, there may be others, of course, the moral issues, but I see these three as a key big building blocks to deal with the future of South Africa.
Gentlemen, very interesting discussion indeed, but that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our panel of experts, Thembisa Fakude, Senior Research Fellow and Director at the Africa-Asia Dialogues, Crown Prince Adil Nchebeleng, a Royal Prince of the Royal Rao Nchebeleng Tribal Authority in Limpopo, South Africa, and Mr. Kofi Kwaukau, the Africa Analyst and Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and do join us again next week for more of Talk Africa. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Until next time, it's goodbye.